Hello, and welcome to Vision New England's Church in Action podcast. Here we talk with New England leaders about critical issues that impact how Christians engage in our culture to accelerate evangelism.
Hi, I'm Charles Galda. Welcome to the Church in Action podcast. We believe when the people of God are known for love and unity and doing good works to serve others and fix our communities, that's evangelistic. Jesus told us that in John 17, and he told us that in Matthew 5. And that's why he tells us to make disciples. Disciples are people who are willing to take risks on God, who are willing to disadvantage ourselves, like Jesus, to serve and love others and to benefit them. And we do that, the reason it's evangelistic is then people want to know who our Jesus is. And so on our podcast, we talk about issues of God and culture to accelerate our ability to make disciples who love our neighbors, do justice, and share Jesus, transforming New England and the world. And I've got two people with us today, two special guests who are amazing Christian leaders in a number of realms and who are very much focused on that. Pat and Tammy McLeod serve as crew chaplains at Harvard. Tammy is also the director of college ministry at Park Street Church in Boston. Tammy is also an association director of Vision New England, which are the people who tell Vision New England what we should be doing to serve the church. And together, they're co-authors of their book, Hit Hard. And so we're going to probably touch on each one of those areas today as we talk. But Pat and Tammy, thanks for being with us, and thanks for all you do.
It's great to be here, Charles.
Yeah, thank you, Charles, for having us.
Thanks. Well, let's start by just getting to know each other a little bit. I'm sure some of our listeners will know you guys from one of your different roles. But give us a little bit of background, and you guys choose who gets to go first. But give us a little bit about your backstory, how you got called to ministry, how you got saved, and how you landed in Boston or Cambridge. Sorry.
I'll start. So I was raised in a non-Christian family and became a follower of Christ in college. I was pretty much a very superstitious collegiate athlete who did anything I could to win. And I thought having God on my side would help. That put me in the community of a lot of Christian people, and I soon learned that Christianity was different than what I thought it was. And so that was my coming to Christ moment. It was probably my first week in college when someone asked me a question. It was actually at Chaplains, someone who did what we do now. He worked on staff with crew on campus, said, "If you were to die tonight, stand before God." And he said, "Why should I let you into heaven? What would you say?" And I thought about it for a while, and I said, I think last week I could have made it in, but I'm pretty sure I couldn't make it in this week. And he gave me a pamphlet that said, "Read this 3 times and let's get back together." And after reading through this How to Be Sure You're a Christian booklet, I committed my life to Christ.
I love that read it 3 times, right? We read through something, we got to move on. I was just talking to Pastor at breakfast about that, as opposed to, hey, read books of the Bible like 3 times, right? That's a good practice. I like that. I'm going to start saying it. Thanks.
Yeah, it is interesting. It wasn't until the second time through that I realized, I don't think I've done this. I better do this.
Wow. And so now where are you in school, Pat, when this happened?
I was at Montana State University.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so your roots are out west.
That's correct.
Gotcha. And so Tammy, now what about you?
And my roots are in the East. I'm from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and I was at Westchester University. And my sorority sister asked me 3 tough questions. Why are you here? Where are you going? And what really makes you happy? And I couldn't answer those questions. So I sat down during the semester break and tried to write out the answers about growing up in a great family, having strong friends, good boyfriend, lots of accomplishments and achievements. And I thought in all of these things, I would find the answers to her questions, but I didn't. So I ended up wadding up the piece of paper I was writing on, throwing it across the floor and yelling out, "God, what's missing?" And when I got back to campus, there was somebody sitting in my dorm lobby. I was working at the desk and I said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And she said, taking leadership surveys. So I asked her if I could take one. And the last question was, what do you think of Jesus as a leader? And I said, I think he was a great leader. So she asked me to be in a Bible study. And I didn't know what that meant. I had never heard those words before. So I thought, well, I'll try, because I'm trying to find the answers to these questions from my friend. And I went and I just fell in love with the Word of God. It's the first time I had ever read the Bible. And I just kept wanting to go and go. And I eventually went to a retreat. And at the retreat, I heard how to become a Christian for the very first time. And there I placed my faith in Christ. So it was, for both of us, the college days where we met Jesus.
And so, but you're on almost opposite ends of the country at that point. So how do you meet each other?
So we went on a summer mission with Crew at Wildwood, New Jersey. So Pat came across, and when I saw him, I thought, oh, it's so amazing. He loves God so much, but he's a half a year older in Christ than I am. So I never thought about us getting together. But by the end of the summer, he said to me, could we go for a walk tonight? And I thought he was going to confront me. I thought I did something wrong because I was in his committee. And I was just like thinking, what did I do? What did I do? But he said, I feel differently about you than any other girl on this trip. And so that was the beginning. I was shocked. I had no idea. He was telling me he liked me. And that was the beginning of our relationship. And it was also the place where God called me to full-time ministry. So on that summer mission is where the call came.
I'm going to put Pat on the spot now. Pat, Tammy was the first girl on that trip you said that to, right? That wasn't just some line.
Yeah. And actually, it's interesting, Charles, because it was one of those love at first sight moments for me. So the very first time I saw her, I had this thought go through my mind that I'll admit one other time in my life I had thought this thought. But that person I never even talked to. I just saw her, and I just realized I'm now at the age that I could actually get married. And I thought, when I saw Tammy, I just saw her and I said, I wonder if I'm going to marry that girl. Wow. And so I was completely Twitter-pated from the moment I saw her, but didn't tell her until the very end of it was literally the last week of the project when someone confronted me and said, hey, what's going on here? And he encouraged me to tell her. And so I just declared to her that I was interested. She said, well, actually, that's not what I was thinking. She didn't tell you that part. Yeah, she was like, well, kind of, she said that. And so I pretty much got shut down until the next day she came and she goes, yeah, I think we should spend some time together.
That seems to be a very common theme among married couples.
Yeah, our relationship was long distance.
That's what I said, because you both go home now, right?
Yeah. And it was all through letters, phone calls, and then she came out to visit, and I asked her to marry me.
Wow. And so you guys are how old about at this point?
22, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. So senior year of college.
Right.
Okay. And so then how do you get from, we're in the opposite ends of the country, but we're going to get married to, we're with Crew in Cambridge.
Yeah. So, we pretty much decided on that summer mission that we wanted, if possible, to become missionaries. But we were thinking international, at least I was. And I don't know, there's more to this story than I can say. I don't want to go down too far, but the bottom line is that we had been strongly influenced by some people who talked just about the numbers of unreached people in the world. And Tammy actually went back to her campus, and her new discipler on her campus had just returned from the Middle East. And she didn't know that I was praying for this, but I was praying that if God wanted us to get married, that he would put on her heart a compassion for and desire to do ministry among the least reached people in the world. And so without knowing that I was praying for that, she starts telling me what she'd been learning from this person who just returned from the Middle East. And that was one of about 20 very specific prayer requests that I had listed on this sheet of paper saying, God, if you want me to marry Tammy, make these things true in our relationship. That was one of them. Another was that our love for God was growing stronger together than it had ever been apart. Our ministries in the lives of other people were more fruitful than they had ever been. And like I said, about several of the others of those, one of which was, and that we would never let the sun go down on our anger. If we were mad at each other, we would resolve it. Well, every time one of these was answered in a specific way, I would write that in my prayer journal. And when she came out to visit me, we got into our first fight, but we resolved it before the sun went down. And the next day I was praying through that list that I did on every Wednesday. And I checked off that one and about 3 more, and I looked at it and they were all answered. And so that was the night I asked her to marry me.
Well, it shows that God does bring wisdom, because I'm comparing this to my wife's story. We weren't saved when we got married. I'm like, if you said, why'd you marry? I'm like, well, she's pretty cute, you know? So there was no list. And so now for folks who may not know Cru, or even by the old name Campus Crusade, what do you guys do?
Yes, I wanted to add something to the last question too. We worked first with Cru for 2 years in California, then 10 years in Montana. Okay. And then we came to Boston, and we came to Boston because of Pat wanting to study science and religion. And one of the top schools for that was in Boston University. Okay. So Cru is an international interdenominational organization. And so the branch of Cru that we work with is the campus ministry. And so we're working on the campuses of Boston. We're particularly at Harvard right now. And what we're trying to do is give every student a chance to be able to hear about hope and life in Christ. So our goal is that there would be no one who would graduate without having that opportunity.
I can hear some people saying, but Harvard, come on, you must have your days open to you because nobody at Harvard's a Christian and nobody at Harvard is interested in this message. Is that a fair perspective?
Yeah, you know, it is interesting to me because one of the first, we didn't come here to work at Harvard. That actually, I came here to get a PhD and then go back to Montana and teach a class on science and religion that we'd already started. But yeah, that moment was, I was asked if I would, you know, at least temporarily assume the responsibilities of the chaplain at Harvard. And so I started meeting with some guys and I asked them in one of our first meetings, I said, how many of your non-Christian friends do you think when it comes to Christianity are rejecting Christianity versus a caricature of Christianity? It was based on that quote, I think by C.S. Lewis, where he says, people aren't really rejecting Christianity or Christ, they're rejecting a caricature of Christianity. That they answered, one person said, you know, I'd say like, you know, 60%, other guys like 80%. Another guy says, I don't think a single one of the people I know who aren't Christians have any idea really what Christianity is about. I think that's still often the situation. And I continue to ask that question, but that was when I realized that, yeah, this is what I want to be a part of. It's like, that's one thing I can do is I can help people come to a clear understanding of the simple message of the Christian faith and give them a chance to say yes to it. And so we've been doing that now for 20 years. And we find that, yeah, it's pretty much the case that most people come here thinking it's, you know, it's sort of a foundation for morality. It's a story that helps people cope with life's uncertainties. It's, you know, sort of superstition. It's and that kind of thing.
I've found at Harvard that the administrators, coaches, faculty have been very open and very warm to our work. So I actually haven't experienced hostility as a campus minister. But on campus, we're doing outreach and discipleship. So we'll mentor and counsel students. But this year I also added one thing. It's actually been for the past 2 years, grief groups. So I'm meeting with a lot of students who lost loved ones, and then we expanded it in the pandemic to other types of loss, like ambiguous loss. So I've really appreciated being able to train leaders at Harvard. So the people who work with the undergrads, I've been able to talk to them about ambiguous loss. And the students who have lost loved ones or who have other great losses have really appreciated just the space to be able to process. So that's been a new part of my work at Harvard.
So it sounds like similar to other realms of life outside the Ivy Leagues, that there is this perception I have of Christianity that I react to, or the caricature, Pat, the way you were saying. But there's still a receptivity because folks are sitting down, especially where there's needs. There's still a receptivity to the gospel.
Yeah.
And I always think of you guys as being so strategic, right? This isn't probably a good theological way to think about it, but one Harvard person who's probably going to go lead some company or have a big influence on the world is going to have a bigger impact for Christianity in human terms than somebody who went to the school I went to and then went on and did my career. Is that in your thinking at all? I just think about the impact Harvard people can have on the world. It's different than some people because their networks and education and stuff.
I mean, I think it's without a doubt true that college students in general are going to be the future leaders in the public and private square. I think one unique thing about Boston in general is that it's host to more top tier universities than any other city in the country. There are more schools rated in the top 40 here in Boston than there are in any city. And there's a density of, and there's 43 colleges and universities. So I think these are very prestigious universities. They are well networked. Without a doubt, a lot of national and world leaders are going to come through this place. But I will, one thing I do want, we have a son who Tammy's going to go tell him to be quiet. One of those Harvard students is in our own house right now because he can't live on campus. And he has a girlfriend, and he just got a call from her, I think, so he's pretty excited. What's interesting to me is having come from a school that is kind of on the margins of State University in Montana, I've been amazed at how influential some of these farmer kids have been in the world and what incredible missionaries they make. I mean, the chaplain for Crew at Stanford is a Montana kid from the sticks, and he's got his PhD in social ethics, and he's helping steer our entire organization in its thinking. I mean, this is a guy that wouldn't even go to school. He would just play basketball all day when he was at college. And yet he would still get straight A's, but he wasn't driven like these students are here. Can I add one other thing though, Charles? Here's the reality though of these schools, not probably just Harvard. I think this is safe to say is true of a lot of the schools in the city and even, college students in general in America. But we are setting records right now in all these areas that you don't want to be setting records. Like the number of students that are coming into Harvard Health Services with anxiety issues that are debilitating at times is higher than it's ever been. And it's the same with depression. And it's the same with addiction, and it's same with loneliness. Loneliness is now an epidemic in America, and particularly acute among this Gen Z generation. So, and there's more. Suicide, it actually is in record-breaking levels, and so I think that the needs and the brokenness is felt strongly, and we're trying to find ways to reach them. Tammy could probably tell you a good story of when you talk about, strategic and trying to reach them, how we're attempting at least to adapt our approach to outreach in order to reach people that are in these kind of situations.
Yeah.
Would you? Yeah, love to hear it.
Just one particular story. Cindy was the captain of her athletic team at Harvard, and she started thinking about the meaninglessness of life as she was sitting in her home this year. She had more space. She didn't enroll in school. And she started searching online for groups at Harvard where she might be able to search for meaning. And she came across our group, and she listened to the stories that we had put on there.
That we put on just because of the pandemic, when we realized how are we going to reach out now that students are not here physically. So we populated our website with some testimonies from some of our student leaders, and she listened to those. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so she contacted me, and I got her connected with a small group, one that was science and faith that deals with tough questions, because she had a lot of those. And then one that Pat and I had just created, a small group experience on Jesus and anxiety. And she said, I have both of these. I have big questions and I have anxiety. So could I be in both groups? So sometime in the fall, as she went through those groups, she came to know Jesus. And now she's meeting with me on Zoom to reach out to new people who have never heard about Jesus. So this brand new person to faith is now helping to reach out to other people.
I keep thinking back to a year ago, back in March when all this COVID stuff happened. And if you said, hey, this is going to be a story that comes out of it, we'd all sat there going, no, not a chance. It doesn't work that way, right? It's just been so amazing to see that, as painful as COVID has been and is, right? There's been amazing things God has done in it. And that's such a cool story. And so touch, if you will, just a little bit on what your work is with Park Street, Tammy.
So at Park Street, I'm the director of college ministry there. So I try to help make sure that in the city of Boston, we're trying to reach every student, 250,000 students with the gospel. So there's a partnership between Cru and Park Street Church, and we're trying to make sure that there's a faith community on every campus. So right now we're on 24 of the 45 campuses. Okay. So that's part of my role, is the missions outreach. But then the other part is the in-house college ministry at Park Street. So I'm also working on that. And Pat and I actually live in a house with 10 other people. And it's a big campus ministry house owned by Park Street. And all the people in it do college ministry. So we're also helping to facilitate that.
So I want to clarify, just in case anybody thinks you're living in a commune right now.
Yeah, not a commune. So we have our own apartment on floor number 2.
Yeah.
And then the guys are on floor 1 and the women are on floor 3. So we actually have our own separate space, but the guys and the gals actually have shared kitchen space and living room space.
And I assume Pat sits between the floors with a shotgun. And that's your office space too, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so now you guys are doing Cru at Harvard. Pat, I don't know if your education, the studying you were doing on science and faith was over at this point or not, but you're working, Tammy, at Park Street, and you guys get you're at a major event for Cru kicking off the year, and you get a call one day. And so tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, so it was at our first large group citywide meeting. So this was students from all over the city, and it had just ended. So if you can imagine, it's almost like the mosh pit of a concert, because it was, like a band, and students were really excited to see each other. Everyone's happy and celebrating. And a Harvard student comes up behind me and impatiently interrupts a conversation I'm in with the student, says, your son needs to talk to you. She handed me her phone. He'd been calling us, but our phones were tucked away. And so he found a way to get a hold of someone who was there at the meeting, and she answered her phone. It was my son, Nate, who was home alone at that point. And our youngest son, Soren, was actually with us at the meeting. Our oldest daughter had just gone to college. And then our second born son, Zach, was the one who was playing football. And anyway, I get on the phone. And Nate just lays into me, Dad, why aren't you answering your phone? He says, he said, Zach's been hurt. And he said, parents were calling, and then the coaches started calling, and now the hospital is calling. They said that he collapsed on the football field, that he's now being airlifted to the hospital, and that he will need to undergo an emergency brain surgery, and they're needing your permission. So literally within a minute or two, we were flying down Massachusetts Avenue to a hospital we'd never been before, but would spend many days going back to Boston Medical. And when we arrived, we met a doctor who told us, he had suffered a traumatic brain injury, that they'd need to remove his skull cap, extract a blood clot, and cauterize some blood vessels, and that this procedure was necessary to save his life, but he could die. And then he could also have a full recovery or anything in between. And then, would you sign here? He said, we did. And they whisked him away. And that was the beginning of the story. So 5 hours later, they call us in. The doctor says we did what we could do. Now we just have to wait. Do you have any questions? And we had a lot of questions, but we weren't sure what they were. And he was gone. And the good news is that Zach survived, but the bad news is a significant portion of his brain didn't. And that was really our introduction into this world of ambiguous loss.
And so I want to talk about how you guys experienced it, and I want to talk about how your kids experienced it. But tell me a little bit more about then Zach's recovery, and then there's another instance that causes him another relapse, if you will. I don't know the right term, but can you share a little bit more about his personal journey maybe in it?
Yes. So he had 5 weeks in the ICU, and then we moved to Spalding for 4 months. And so at Spalding, he learned to sit again, to walk again, to eat again. And they were trying to get his speech back so he would be able to say one sentence super slowly. But eventually, by the time we were done with the Spalding 4 months, they said Zach is injured so severely that he will not be able to go home with you. His best chance for a strong recovery would be to send him to a residential neuro rehab school. And so that's what we did. We chose the May Center, and there he started in school trying to learn things over again. So he was injured on the left side of his brain, and so the right side of his body doesn't work very well. So he has a brace on his right leg at the bottom. He actually can walk, so he's mobile right now, but he still can't talk very much. He can say sentences, but some people don't know what he's saying. We do. So his speech is really still limited, and also his short-term memory. You can meet him, Charles, and then 5 minutes later meet him, and he would be so excited to see you again. So physically, he is in rough shape from the brain injury, but his spirit is joyful. He totally lives in the present. He's the happiest person I know, and his love for God and for people didn't change at all.
Yeah, you can see that on some of the videos you guys have on your website about this, where he's just delighted to see everybody in a way that really we all should be delighted to see everybody, but are not. And so now, so he's on, I don't want to say path to recovery because it's not recovery, but he's on a path to whatever the new normal is going to be for him. And he gets dropped off at the house one night, and there's a mishap. And so what happens? Because I think that kind of restarts some of the journey, doesn't it? What happens then?
So I was actually in my study trying to get as much done as I could before Zach came home for the weekend. Tammy was arranging to meet Zach. I thought typically we had met him at the school, which is where he would be dropped off from his residential rehab school every Friday night. But I didn't know this, but they had made arrangements to deliver him to our house that week, and they were also going to be using a new transportation service. This all sounds very detailed, but the point of it all is that it's a story about everything that could possibly have gone wrong did, and any one thing that could have possibly gone right that would have changed things didn't. Basically, is brought to the front door, not to our door. Secondly, the person who answered that door was someone in the house who had just arrived in the house and hadn't been trained in how Zach would never use the spiral staircase in our house. He would always use our staircase where there's these handrails. And that he would never go upstairs alone, and all these kinds of things. So this person answers the door. Zach's really eager to see her and hugs her. The delivery guy, who's new, thinks that this is fine. And so Zach takes off up the stairs. Another terrible thing that happened to go wrong is right before Christmas, we'd put these garlands on the stairwell or the railing that goes up the spiral staircase. And so when Zach just tears up the steps to get to us, in his last step, he takes 2 steps instead of 1 because he just wanted to get there quickly, but that kind of threw him off balance. He had a backpack on. Bottom line is he falls over the banister. And I just am at my desk thinking I'm alone in the house. And I hear this thud. And it shook the house. I'm like, what the heck was that? And so I get up and go to the door just to make sure something bad didn't happen. And someone had come up from downstairs saying Zach just fell over the banister and he's lying unconscious. He'd fallen about 12 feet. And when I got to him, he opened his eyes and then his eyes rolled back and he stopped breathing. And I thought I was gonna see my son die in my arms. He didn't. He did, though, suffer the same injury he had suffered before, and it erased all of those 4 years of recovery in one instant. And we were back where we started again in a emergency room, signing papers, allowing them to go in for now a 4th time into his brain to keep him alive.
And so this is 4 years into the journey. And so then does he go through all the same rehab, retraining? And so now how long ago is all of this?
So we're at year 12 now.
Okay.
And
8 years ago.
Yeah, about 8 years ago.
Okay.
So we did everything over again. ICU, Spalding, back to the May Center. And at one meeting with May Center staff, it was really discouraging because every person went around and said, he's regressed. Like every report from every therapist said that he's not come back to where he was before the fall. But at the end, one therapist said, but I think he's happier. So,
And
everyone nodded.
Everyone started like anecdotally adding comments, verifying what she said, that somehow, though more physically and maybe even mentally disabled, he was happier.
Yeah, and so now let's pause on Zach's story and let's talk about you guys. And so how are you experiencing this journey? Because you've got a job, you've got jobs to do, you're in ministry, you've got 3 other kids, I assume expenses, emotions, right? And you cover all of this and hit hard, I know, but walk us through some of that if you would.
We dealt with this very differently. So when you go through a loss and you have a life partner, you think they will be there in the loss, but we actually started to conflict because Pat was so much more focused on the Zach we still had, and I was focused on the Zach we lost. So I was spending a lot of time grieving. So the first couple weeks I would be flat on the floor, on my face, crying out to God. I would want to get out of the hospitals I just needed fresh air and sunlight. So I would just go running by the river and listen to Zach's worship songs while I ran and just grieve as I was running. Pat wanted to stay in the hospital and be right by his side. So we had a lot of conflict coming in because of how we were dealing with it differently.
And so does that conflict then just continue to compound through this 4-year journey, or how are you guys even dealing with the conflict? Maybe that's a better way to pursue it.
Wow. At the
And Tammy, if I can, did you even realize that was the problem?
Yeah, well, at the 1-year mark, I realized Zach is not going to have a strong recovery. So that's what I was praying for. But I realized about the 1-year mark that wasn't going to happen. And so I started reading books on grieving. And I was like, these books are not helping at all because the person I'm talking about didn't die. So even the best book that I read on grief, it's supposed to be the #1 on grief counseling and grief therapy. It had one sentence for people like us. And that sentence was, we need to do a lot more study on this type of loss. So
which made you feel really good at that, uplifted.
So then I just finally decided, since none of my colleagues knew book recommendations, they didn't know about the type of loss we were dealing with. No pastors that I talked with knew books about our type of grief. So I finally just called Spalding and said, could you tell me what this type of grief is? I just want to do a research paper on it, and I don't know the term. So the next day, the librarian from Spalding wrote back and said, your term is ambiguous loss. And he sent articles by Pauline Boss. And I read those and then ordered her books. And when I opened the books, I thought, oh, finally somebody understands me. So it was really understanding about ambiguous loss that I think really helped us deal with what we were dealing with in our marriage, because we felt the torque and we felt that we were doing two different things. But after reading her books, we actually saw why we were having problems.
And so what is ambiguous loss then? And why was that the source of your conflict?
Ambiguous loss, there are two types. And the first one is when you physically don't have the body, but the person's still psychologically with you. So that would be like kidnapped kids, people missing due to war, terrorism, natural disasters, but also divorce, adoption, and immigration. So all of those would be that first type. And then the second type is what we're dealing with. So that's when you have the person, but you don't have them the same psychologically. So traumatic brain injury, Alzheimer's, dementia, addiction, mental illness that's severe.
So there is loss, that person and the dreams that you didn't even know you had for them, probably, right? All of that stuff is gone. But the person is still there and with you, but in a different way.
Yeah.
And so, Tammy, you're grieving that loss. Pat, you're, I assume, grieving as well, but it sounds like maybe more focused on the recovery and the guy who's still with you.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And so now, but some of that sounds like relates to the different relationship you had with Zach too. Is that fair?
Yeah, the way I used to relate to Zach was talking. So he would ask me, how are you doing? And we'd have these big long talks, and I would check in on him, and we would pray every night together, and we would sing worship songs together. And then all of a sudden he can't talk anymore. So I lost the way I connected with him. So what Boss talks about is you don't lose the bond. The bond doesn't change at all. So that strong mother bond, that strong spiritual bond on top of the mother bond that we had was still there, but I had to revise the way I related to Zach. So like now I play guitar with him, but his right hand doesn't work. So he is doing the left hand, and he remembers all the chords because he has long-term memory. So he'll play the left hand and I'll play the right hand. And he can't really sing that much, so I'm just singing now. And when we pray, he can't really say too much, so I'm just praying. Reading the scripture, I just read to him. So it's different. I had to learn how to relate to him differently. Yeah.
And when you read the book, you can't help but see he was a pretty unique young man to begin with. I think about some of the stories you tell about the spiritual maturity that comes through, the heart for Jesus that comes through. That's just so evident that you're like, I don't think this kid can be the age you're talking about, right? Because there's just so much there. Now, he's a very unique individual today, of course, too, but in a different way. So how much of it is, hey, look, he's your kid, so you guys see him special, versus he really was special and still is?
Yeah. I think that's true. I mean, I've had people say those things that, that know him. And, I do think that's sort of the problem with writing that book is it does almost sound like a, hagiography.
Zach the Saint.
And what parent doesn't want to write a hagiography about their kid? As Zach was, he's there, and some of his daredevil stuff and his sort of little rebellious stuff comes out in the book, that he's far from a perfect kid, but there was something, and still is something, really very deep and profound about his love for Christ and his ability to continue to reveal him even in his disability.
Yeah, I think because I could write the hagiography of my kids, because I think they're wonderful, of course, but I wouldn't have the stories that you guys can tell that would back up the hagiography. and so it doesn't change how special my kids are, and I love them. But you guys tell, I think the South Africa story just sticks with me. Can you tell a little about your family experience with South Africa and kind of Zach through the years on that? Because I think it was a glimpse of, I think, how he had a unique relationship with Jesus before the injury that It sounds like is still there today.
Yeah. Zach, something special happened in his life on our first trip to South Africa, and we had actually completed the second one when he came back. And I think that was when he was telling Tammy that he just was ready to drop out of high school, become a missionary, move to South Africa, marry a Black South African, and adopt 10 AIDS orphans. That was his vision for his life. And he told me, actually, the week before his injury, we were in the kitchen making breakfast, and we were reflecting on our most recent visit to South Africa, where we had, ironically, the first and only time where we lived next to a disabled children's home for children that had disabilities, and we worked there, and the disabilities were very, very extreme and very they were unsettling. In fact, after our first day of touring the facility, some of our students couldn't even eat lunch. They just sat outside the lunchroom and wept and prayed, because it was just pretty overwhelming. Yet all of them, including us and Zach, said at the end that was the highlight of their trip, was having a chance to serve and get to know and actually get beyond that initial first impression of a disability, to begin to see glimpses of God's image in the lives of people and the way he uniquely reflects his glory in those individuals. That was a transformational moment. So here we are back in America, and Zach and I are sharing breakfast, and we were reflecting on our memory of the kids that we loved. And Zach turns to me and says, "Dad, this may sound weird, but I wondered if God might ever have me become like one of those children." And I took it serious, and I just said to him, "Zach, if anything ever did happen, we would love you the same way we love those kids, right?" And he said, "Yeah, I know, Dad." then like I say, a week later, we're in an ICU room with a son with a severe traumatic brain injury. Now, he did, interestingly, after, what was it, 5 weeks of being in an ICU, he was released to go to Spalding Rehab. He had a feeding tube in him. He hadn't really communicated hardly anything yet. But the speech therapist had gave him this tablet where he could point to letters on a keyboard. He could point to these letters and spell out something he was trying to say. And he was obviously trying to say something. So we pulled that out and we said to him, Zach, just point to the letters and tell us what you're trying to say. And he basically spelled out his first sentence, which couldn't have been more profound and more appropriate. He said, "Don't go back to Africa without me."
You're reminding me of Johnny Erickson, how she talks about the church can't be the church without the disabled. Mm-hmm. So, because we're not reflective of humanity, and the weakest among us, the disabled are the visibly weakest among us. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, not really the weakest among us. Mm-hmm. And so, for you guys, what's been the toughest part of the journey, and what's been one of the things that that is just a delight to experience with Zach?
Let's see. Yeah, the toughest part for me, I would say, is just that Zach doesn't have a voice. I can't talk with him anymore, so I miss that connection with him in that way. And the greatest delight, I think it's still pretty fun that we can do music together, even though it's a little weird. I mean, most people don't play guitars with one person doing one hand and one doing the other.
Yeah.
But those are some of the highlights for me, is seeing him be able to sing worship song or play worship songs he loves and do that with him again.
Nice. Pat, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things that come on the radar screen when you ask that question, Charles. One is, I think there's a proclivity to think that when something like this happens in your life, where one person is injured, that the only thing that really gets influenced and affected by that injury is your relationship with the injured person. But in a family unit, that's not the case. It's like everyone's relationship with everyone is tweaked by that dynamic. And it's one reason I wanted to really write this book, is that, it's been really difficult on our kids to lose Zach. He played such an important role in each of our lives. And, we're still in the process of dealing with all of that and recovering from that. And I wanted to be able to capture in words these moments where God broke through for us and revealed himself on this journey, so that before I forgot them, like the story I just told you about the kitchen, that's one of several stories we tell in the bigger story of Hit Hard, that do what I think Hit Hard does. What Hit Hard does, in my opinion, is it's a story that tells you that our small stories of loss and pain and suffering in life, they beg for a bigger story that can help make sense of them. And Zach's life points us to that bigger story. And these moments I'm telling you about, they were moments where I felt like God was reminding us that there's a bigger story going on here. And that bigger story can absorb this, and it can make sense of this, and it can give us actually even hope in the midst of this. And when I say this, I don't mean just the fact that Zach survived and Zach still honors and glorifies God, but that the world is broken, that is filled with suffering. I mean, how do you explain that? What does explain that? And what could be a more profound explanation or response, let's say, to the existence of pain and suffering in the world, is a God who suffers, a crucified God, a God who, when he came into this world and revealed himself, allowed himself to be the recipient of the greatest injustice and most horrendous, excruciatingly painful deaths that could be inflicted by the very people he created. I mean, it's such a profound story. And that's, you know, that's been a kind of a recurring theme in my journey, is that when people hear us, you know, tell our story, they ask the question, how in the world did you hold on to your faith? You got, especially in a non-Christian context, people are like, so you guys are chaplains, and yeah, you had this terrible thing happen to you. Certainly that must have shaken your faith. And both of us kind of looked at each other and we're just kind of like, no, not really. And next question. And it's like, we realize that we need to just answer that more substantially by saying to them, listen, if what you're asking is, do we have doubts in our faith? Have we ever questioned our faith? Yes, we have multiple times. I have, at least. But ironically, none of those occurred in the context of Zach. In fact, to the very contrary, like if I had to list the 5 moments in my life where I felt like God was so clearly present and real in this world, 4 of them would be on this journey with Zach, and in ways that completely caught me off guard and surprised me. But the God who showed up and the God who met me in those moments was not the philosopher's God. You know, it wasn't the unmoved mover of Aristotle or something like that. It was a crucified God. It was a God who understood suffering, a God who understood pain, a God who came into this world to help us escape that forever, who gives a message of hope to us that we can one day be released from pain and suffering and evil for eternity. That's an incredible story.
Yeah, I always would say to our Sunday school class, I have yet to meet the Christian who says, you know, we're at this phase in our life where my job was going great, business was doing well, marriage was in good shape, everything was going right with the kids, and I just grew so much with the Lord during that time. Right? We don't like to admit it, but it's those tough times where we really find God in a different way. And so I appreciate you guys being willing to share it and to write about it. There were so many insights for me, and it's heartbreaking and it's gut wrenching and it's encouraging. And so tell us a little about, Tam, were you going to say something before I go on the next?
Oh, I had the same experience. It was the most surprising thing to me in grief, that I read Psalm 34 before, but it became so real that the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. So where is God? Near to the suffering.
Yeah.
And so now I have a lot more courage when I'm working with students, because they've actually experienced a lot of pain, even as 20-year-olds. And I'd encourage them to move toward the pain and deal with and grieve your losses, because that you're going to meet God there. That's where he is. He's near the suffering.
Yeah. We know it works that way. We don't particularly like that it works that way, but we do know it. And so tell us about, where is Zach today? How is Zach doing?
So he is now in a group home. So he lives with 4 guys who have disabilities, and they have 5 staff in the house. And Zach has a one-on-one staff. Someone has to be with him 24/7. So the person sits by him all night and walks him to the bathroom. He wears a gait belt, so you have to hold on to him every step, because he could have another brain injury if he falls. He has right side weakness of all kind. And again, his speech and short-term memory did not really return. So he has very little of both of those. But again, super joyful and happy. And he does lots of fun things. So he does bike riding, rock climbing, rowing with community rowing. And he, at church, when we're in service or in person, he's a greeter, and we do communion together. He, during COVID, had to go into lockdown. So that was one of the hardest times. So we were separated for many months that we didn't get to see him. And we had one break in the summer where we were allowed to see him. And then just right before Easter, they let him come out of his lockdown. So we got to go into Park Street since the service was online, and we got to sing together for the first time in a year. So the lockdown was hard, but it's nice. It seems like things are opening up for him.
And so you tell a story about that he, if I remember it right, that you're walking down the street with him someplace and he goes and he hugs the homeless guy and tells him about Jesus. And I'm like, that sounds like that should be us, right?
Yeah.
And so he's I watched some of the videos, like he's a role model, right? He's riding the bicycle down. Tell folks where they can watch these videos, please.
Pat and Tammy McLeod.com. So Tammy is Tammy, McLeod, McLeod. But we put a tab on there that says Zach, and you can see all his videos. It's fun.
And he's delighted to see everybody, right? In a way that if the joy of Christ were better in me, I'd be delighted to see people that way too. But it just, I'm not where he is. And so there's a love of Jesus there that just comes out and is so obvious in how he interacts with people and sees people. It's beautiful to see. And so if I'm somebody who this is resonating with me, with maybe an experience I've had, clearly they should get the book, Hit Hard. You can get it on Amazon. Bob will put the link into the chat window. But what should I do? What would be your advice?
So I'll just start with discover new hopes. Sometimes we hold on to hopes too long. So for example, Zach is not going to be able to marry. He won't be able to work to support himself. He won't be able to live alone, things like this. You have to shift your hopes in ambiguous loss to something that's attainable. And one thing that helps me in discovering hope is the practice of examine. So I do it every night before bed. It takes 5 minutes, look back over the day with God, say, God, just show me how you met me this day. And I'll write things that were life-giving and life-thwarting. And by looking at the life-giving every day, I can see the in-breaking hope. So the hope of heaven is awesome. I'm going to see Zach again someday and he's going to have a new body. But I need in-breaking hope right now to be able to move through ambiguous loss. So doing the examine every day, I get to see God's in-breaking hope.
Yeah, I can add something, Charles, too, that I want to say that the thing that was most helpful to me about the writings of Pauline Boss was that she says that the real challenge of living with an ambiguous loss is learning to live well with both having and not having at the same time. And that, as you kind of alluded to earlier, we typically will do one or the other, but not both. And it's even more complicated when two people are dealing with the same ambiguous loss, and one is doing one and the other is doing the other. And that's the story of Hit Hard, actually. That's one of the main storylines of the book. And so what I've had to learn as the person who is obsessing over the son I still had, but living in denial about the son I lost, it was important for me to just basically recognize that grief is part of life. You know, you've got to do it. And I realize, and I'm still realizing, that not only was I never taught how to grieve, but I was taught not to grieve. I was raised in a family, like I mentioned, I think earlier, that I was, an athlete. Both my parents were coaches, and they, my dad would taught me, listen, you got to be tough. You show no visible sign of weakness. Big boys don't cry. You focus on the positive. And the one time in my life where I saw my dad actually shed a tear was at his dad's funeral, my grandpa. And I remember all three of us boys, were nudging each other and saying, I think Pa's crying. And he just basically crying was he just got out his Kleenex and he and he blew his nose. But I thought, okay, well, at least there's one place where a man can grieve, and that's at a funeral. And then I became a Christian in college. I went to my first evangelical funeral, and it was a celebration of life. And it seemed like we were being told, no, this is not, it's not appropriate to grieve even here, you know? And so I am learning that, you know, sitting it with emotions, doing it in community with other people is really necessary and needed. And if you don't do that, this stuff is going to get even worse. It's almost like, you know, poison. When those tears come out, like if they don't come out, they're just going to bring about other kind of problems in life. So that would be my encouragement, is to take time to mourn, to lament, to do it in community.
And then two other things that I think are really important. Boss talks about the importance of ceremonies and rituals. So we actually had a ceremony to talk about the losses that we'd experienced, and you can read in the book about it, but it was really powerful for our community. About 150 of us grieved together. So expanding the grief to not just grieving alone, but grieving in community. And then the other thing I wanted to say is there's a lot of pressure in ambiguous loss. Boss calls it the most stressful type of loss because there's no closure. So our very most favorite thing we learned in counseling was be gentle with each other. Because a lot of marriages don't make it through something like this. They end up breaking. But we're just hold on to God and ask for his help to be gentle with each other.
So, and that's good. I'm remembering that phrase now. I thought that was good. And I'm like, I think we probably need that in our regular daily lives anyway. Yeah. And I think, Pat, I think your point too on the guys crying thing, and I'm where you are on it. You know, we sit there and go, and Jesus wept, but I'm a little bit tougher than he is. Right. Right. And so just practically, I want to wrap up, but two more questions I'd love to hear from you on. Practically, financially, this must have been so burdensome to you. And so do you want to talk, don't feel like you have to talk about that, but is there something you'd share on that with folks?
Well, a very practical suggestion to people if you experience anything like this is something that someone said to me early on. And that was, there's a lot of people who love you and want to help. Let them help. You're going to minister to them by letting them help. And so, you know, we did do that from the beginning, and we were so carried along. We've felt so loved by our church, by our network of, the Cru network, and actually, to be honest, by the school itself and the football community. It's been amazing how gracious those our friends have been to us and continue to be in Zach's life. It's amazing how his friends have stayed with him for 12 years now. Yeah, and that's very rarely the case. When someone has a head injury, they lose 90% of all of their relationships within a year. You know, these guys love him and they stay in his life. So
he's actually the manager for the football team. So he goes out on the field when they're in season. They didn't have a season this year, and he helps with the water bottles.
And so how can we pray for you guys? Or how can we pray even? Well, sorry, let me come back to that. So I'll give you a second to think on it, because there was one thing. Your goal in writing the book was evangelistic too. And so, and you clearly talk about your relationship with God and Jesus in the book for folks who read it and might be unsaved, but you've also had the opportunity now to talk about this through some non-Christian channels, as well as Christian channels like us. Where have you been able to tell this story and talk about Jesus for folks to hear it?
Yeah, so we put these all on our website too, but we've been doing a lot of podcasts and written and oral interviews and talks for secular organizations. And the overwhelming response, like when people send back the chat everything is just so positive. People loved it. And we put the disclaimer right up front. We had a Jewish friend who was helping us edit. And we said, what do you think about God being in the story, like as we present it? And he said, you can't tell this story any other way. Your family and Zach, it needs to be in there. And that's the response we've been getting everywhere, whether people are Christians or not. They love the story. And we keep being asked to speak at more and more places when people hear the story. So I think that is actually my prayer request, is if God can use the suffering that we went through to help other people, that is so very encouraging. So I really am praying that God will actually meet, or that people will meet God as they're reading through the book, that many people will come to know him for the very first time. So if you could pray for that, that would be great.
Yeah, I can add to that too, Charles. I appreciate you asking this, by the way. Thank you for doing that. I have a new appreciation for story in general, and the power of story. Not only does a lot of moral learning come from stories, but inspiration comes from it. We basically, our lives are informed and inspired by the heroes that emerge in stories. Stories take us on these emotional journeys that have a way of surfacing and softening some of the hardest emotions. And I just think ambiguous loss is ubiquitous. I think everyone is going to experience it, and they are experiencing it even in the midst of a pandemic. Yeah. And I think this is the kind of story that can surface and validate some of those complicated emotions that people experience when they're stuck in and frozen in grief, And so I would, I pray pretty regularly, not daily, but I try to pray daily, that wherever this story is finding its way onto the lap of someone, or they're listening to it, that God would use this small story to to validate people's pain, to help them to grieve, to help relationships to heal, but to draw them into a bigger story that can make sense and give them hope, and that being the story of the gospel. It is, by the way, I know it's true that most books today like this are being bought by women, middle-aged women. But there's an important, there's a football story here. There's a comeback story. There's an overcoming story. There's an incredible, inspirational story in Zach. There's certainly a relational story about ambiguous loss and dealing with it. But there's an important father-son story here, that I think a man can read and say, I get that, And by the way, sorry, last thing, I promise to stop after this. Ambiguous loss, one of the more common experiences of it that Pauline Boss mentions is the empty nest. And she says it's actually felt more strongly by men, husbands, fathers, than it is by women. And I think, so I think there's some men out there that will appreciate just a story that helps them connect with their heart and their love for their kid, So.
Yeah, it was interesting to me because it's a compelling read. Right, you pick it up, and were it not for the emotion, and you guys know me enough to know I'm not the most emotional person in the world, right? And so the only reason I didn't read it in one setting because the story is so compelling is that I just needed to put it down for a while, and get away from it because it is so emotional in places. And so I appreciate you guys so much. Your faithful service to the kingdom in the Boston area, in New England, around the world. But I appreciate your partnership with us and for writing the book and sharing the story. I know it couldn't be easy to keep going through it, but also your faithful service in doing it for a greater purpose. And so I'm grateful to you both for it. So thanks for being with us today.
Yes. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Charles, for what you guys do. And we appreciate you just taking an interest in the story.
Thanks. God bless you both. And we'll be back next week And so tune in then. Thanks.
Thank you for joining the podcast today. If you'd like to learn more about Vision New England and what God is doing in our region, check out our website at visionnewengland.org. We hope you'll join us next time for the Church in Action podcast.